I never thought I'd be the person sitting in an empty house, staring at a legal document that felt more like a death warrant than a piece of paper. But here I am. And I need to know if I'm the monster everyone says I am, or if I'm just a mother who finally fought back. My son-in-law, a man I welcomed into my home with open arms, married my only daughter not out of love, but because he saw my property as his retirement plan. And the moment the wedding cake was finished, he showed his true face by walking through my front door with a notary in tow to demand I sign over the deed. Was I wrong for the way I dismantled his life after that? Or would you have done the exact same thing if the person your child loved tried to turn you into a homeless stranger in your own living room? This didn't start with a legal battle. It started 3 years ago when my daughter, Sarah, brought Mark home for the first time. I wanted to like him so badly because Sarah had been through a string of bad relationships, and seeing her eyes light up when she talked about Mark made me feel like she had finally found her forever. He was charming, perhaps a bit too charming in hindsight, always knowing exactly what to say to make me feel respected and valued. I'm a widow, and I've lived in this 4-bedroom Victorian home for 30 years. It's where I raised Sarah, and it's where every memory of my late husband is stored in the floorboards and the crown molding. Mark was very interested in those floorboards from day one, often asking about the history of the house, the current market value in our rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, and even the cost of the upkeep. At the time, I thought he was just being a practical, future-thinking young man who wanted to understand the family's assets. But looking back, he was just surveying the land he intended to conquer. Sarah is a sweet girl, but she's always been a bit naive when it comes to people's intentions, and she was so blinded by the whirlwind romance that she didn't notice how Mark slowly started isolating her from her friends while simultaneously nesting deeper into my life. When they got engaged, Mark suggested they move in with me to save for a down payment on their own place. Against my better judgment, I agreed, thinking it would be nice to have life in the house again. But the moment he moved his boxes in, the atmosphere changed. He started making small comments about how the house was too big for one woman, or how the stairs were getting dangerous for me as I got older. He would point out repairs that needed to be done and then sigh about how expensive they were, subtly suggesting that if the house were in his name, he could take out a loan to fix everything up properly. I always brushed it off, telling him I was doing just fine, but the pressure was constant. He even started redecorating without my permission, moving my late husband's favorite armchair to the garage because it didn't fit the modern aesthetic he wanted for the living room. Every time I tried to protest, he would give me this pitying look, the kind you give to someone who's losing their mind, and say, "Don't worry, Margaret. We're just trying to make things easier for you." He was gaslighting me in my own hallway, making me feel like a guest in the home I had worked 3 decades to maintain. He began controlling the mail, intercepting my bank statements, and even suggesting that he should be a co-signer on my accounts just in case of an emergency. It was a slow, agonizing creep of territory. Then came the wedding. It was a beautiful ceremony, and I paid for almost the entire thing, wanting my daughter to have the day of her dreams. I spent over $40,000 on that one day, thinking it was an investment in her happiness. Mark was the picture-perfect groom, crying during the vows and thanking me profusely during his speech for bringing him into the family. He held my hand and whispered that I was like a second mother to him. But the mask didn't even stay on for 24 hours. The morning after the wedding, while Sarah was out running errands, Mark didn't come downstairs for coffee or breakfast. Instead, he waited until I was in the study, and then there was a knock at the door. He wasn't alone. He was standing there with a man carrying a briefcase, a notary he had hired privately. Mark didn't smile, he didn't offer a greeting. He simply walked to my desk, laid out a set of transfer documents, and told me that for the safety of the family, and to ensure Sarah's future, I needed to sign the house over to them immediately. He told me he had already spoken to a lawyer, and that if I didn't comply, he would make sure Sarah chose him over me, and I would never see my future grandchildren. The sheer coldness in his voice was something I'll never forget. He wasn't asking, he was executing a takeover. He had even drafted a clause that gave me life tenancy in a small basement apartment he planned to build, essentially turning me into a tenant in the home I paid off decades ago. He explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that the main floors were too much for me to clean and that young families needed the space more. I felt the room spinning, looking at this stranger who had just married my daughter, realizing he had planned this entire marriage as a real estate transaction. He stood there, hovering over me with a pen, while the notary looked on with an uncomfortably neutral expression. I didn't sign that day. I told them I felt faint and locked myself in my room, but the threat was clear. Mark wasn't going anywhere, and he was ready to use my daughter as a shield to take everything I owned. I could hear him through the door, talking on the phone to someone, his voice sounding triumphant, laughing about how the old bird was rattled and would cave by the end of the week. He started acting like the landlord already, telling me I couldn't cook certain foods because the smell bothered his sinuses, and that he was planning to replace the hardwood floors I loved so much with cheap gray laminate. He was systematically erasing my life while I was still living in it. So that is the nightmare I was living through, trapped between losing my home and losing my relationship with my only child to a man who had calculated every move like a game of chess. Before I tell you the absolute carnage I unleashed to get my revenge, and the secret I found out about Mark that changed everything, I want you to pause right now. Go down to the comments and tell me, what would you do? Would you sign the paper to stay close to your daughter? Or would you fight back even if it meant risking your relationship with her? I really want to know if you think I was being a stubborn old woman or a survivor. After I locked myself in that room, the shock wore off and was replaced by a cold, hard rage I didn't know I was capable of. I realized that if I just told Sarah, Mark would manipulate her into believing I was the one being difficult or confused. Mark wasn't going anywhere, and he was ready to use my daughter as a shield to take everything I owned. I could hear him through the door, talking on the phone to someone, his voice sounding triumphant, laughing about how the old bird was rattled and would cave by the end of the week. He started acting like the landlord already, telling me I couldn't cook certain foods because the smell bothered his sinuses, and that he was planning to replace the hardwood floors I loved so much with cheap gray laminate. He was systematically erasing my life while I was still living in it. So that is the nightmare I was living through, trapped between losing my home and losing my relationship with my only child to a man who had calculated every move like a game of chess. Before I tell you the absolute carnage I unleashed to get my revenge, and the secret I found out about Mark that changed everything, I want you to pause right now. Go down to the comments and tell me, what would you do? Would you sign the paper to stay close to your daughter? Or would you fight back even if it meant risking your relationship with her? I really want to know if you think I was being a stubborn old woman or a survivor. After I locked myself in that room, the shock wore off and was replaced by a cold, hard rage I didn't know I was capable of. I realized that if I just told Sarah, Mark would manipulate her into believing I was the one being difficult or confused. He had spent months planting seeds in her head that I was becoming forgetful and fragile. I needed proof, and I needed a plan that didn't just stop the transfer, but removed Mark from our lives permanently. I started by playing the part of the scared, considering mother. I told Mark I was thinking about his proposal, but needed a week to get my affairs in order. This loosened his guard. He became nice again, bringing me tea and talking about how we were going to fix up the place. While he was out celebrating his impending win at the local bars, I did some digging. I hired a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud, and what I found out made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time Mark had done this. He had a history of marrying into families with significant assets, and he had a quiet, annulled marriage 2 states over where he had successfully sued for a settlement after a dispute over a family business. He was a professional parasite, a man who hunted widows and their daughters like a predator. But more than that, I found out he was already in deep debt to some very unfriendly people, which is why he was in such a rush to get the deed to my house. He needed to use it as collateral for a massive private loan to clear his gambling debts. He had lost nearly $200,000 in underground poker games and was being hounded by collectors. That house wasn't just a retirement plan for him, it was his get-out-of-jail-free card. I also found out he had been skimming money from Sarah's personal savings account since they got engaged, slowly draining her future to fund his habit. Armed with this information, I didn't go to the police. I went to my lawyer and drafted a very different set of papers. I spent the next few days acting perfectly normal, even letting Mark show me his blueprints for the basement apartment he wanted to shove me into. Every time he spoke, I felt a knot of disgust in my stomach, but I smiled and nodded, waiting for the right moment to strike. On the day I told Mark I was ready to sign, I invited him, the notary, and my daughter Sarah into the living room. Sarah looked confused, wondering why we were all gathered around the mahogany desk with so much tension in the air. Mark was beaming, practically vibrating with excitement, thinking he had won. He even brought a bottle of expensive champagne to toast to the family's future. I looked him dead in the eye and handed him a folder. Inside wasn't the deed to the house. It was a thick stack of evidence including his previous marriage records, his debt statements, and a recording I had captured of him threatening to keep me from my grandchildren while Sarah was at the grocery store. Sarah's face went pale as she read through it. She saw the bank transfers from her account to his business, accounts that were actually gambling portals. Mark tried to spin it, shouting that I was framing him, that I was a bitter woman who couldn't handle her daughter growing up. But then I dropped the final hammer. I informed him that I had already transferred the house into a strictly managed irrevocable trust that Sarah couldn't touch until she was 50, and the trustee was a firm that had explicit instructions to never allow Mark on the property again. The house was no longer mine to give or hers to lose. It was protected by a legal wall he couldn't climb. I had also already filed for an emergency restraining order based on the recorded threats and the financial abuse of my daughter. The notary, realizing he was caught in the middle of a criminal scheme and seeing the police report I had already started, packed his bags and left immediately, not wanting any part of the scandal. The fallout was explosive. Mark lost his cool completely, his charming persona shattering into a million jagged pieces. He started screaming, calling me names I won't repeat, and throwing a chair across the room before the police I had pre-called arrived to escort him out. He tried to grab Sarah, to pull her into his lies one last time, but she pushed him away with a strength I didn't know she had. Watching him being led away in handcuffs for the outstanding warrants my investigator had uncovered was the most satisfying moment of my life. Sarah was devastated, but seeing his true, violent nature in that final moment broke the spell he had over her. She spent the next week in bed, crying for the man she thought he was, while I spent it changing every single lock and installing a high-end security system. It took months of therapy and tears, but she realized that he never loved her. He loved the equity in her mother's home. We found out later that he had even tried to take out a secret life insurance policy on me, a detail that still makes me wake up in a cold sweat. Mark tried to sue for a portion of our marital assets from his jail cell, but because I had moved everything into the trust and had proof of his fraudulent intent and the fact that he had stolen from Sarah, he left the marriage with nothing but his original debts and a court order to stay away from us. He's currently serving time for a series of financial crimes uncovered during the investigation. Today the house is quiet again, but it's a peaceful quiet. Sarah and I are rebuilding our bond, and she's finally learning that a person's worth isn't in their charm, but in their character. I protected my home, but more importantly, I protected my daughter from a lifetime of being used and eventually discarded by a man with no soul. My husband's armchair is back in its rightful place in the living room, and I spend my evenings sitting there, looking at the photos of our life together, knowing his legacy is safe. If there's one thing I've learned from this whole mess, it's that blood is thicker than water, but a solid legal trust is thicker than both. You have to be willing to be the bad guy, to save the people you love from the real monsters, even if that monster is someone they chose to love. It wasn't easy, and there are people in our town who think I was too harsh, that I should have handled it within the family. But those people weren't the ones being threatened with a basement apartment and the loss of their grandchildren. Like this video if you were on my side and think Mark got exactly what he deserved. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about people standing their ground and protecting what they've built. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far, or did I do what any parent should? I'll see you all in the next story.